With carbon fiber, though, if you've got it on your braces, it means that you can't then really change anything about them. Whereas if you just have wooden braces, you can go shaving your braces after the fact and dialing things in.
Yeah.
So what are your tools? Since you lose that tool of shaving braces, what tools do you substitute for that to voice or control your top
I
there?
always say voice.
Yeah. Yeah. To tune.
Yeah, to tune the mode frequencies of the top, vibrational mode frequencies of the top. I use my main tool is edge thinning of the top. I mean, I could sort of go through my tuning sequence.
Yeah,
really
I think that would
quickly.
be a bit of
Yeah,
fun.
okay. So I've got my top thickness, I've got my bracing on, and then what I do is I clamp the top on to the guitar body. The back is on now. I clamp the top on and I take some measurements of the at what frequency the modes are vibrating at. And I usually do that with Chladni patterns because there's sort of no guessing as to what mode is vibrating at what frequency with Chladni patterns, because they physically vibrate in front of you. Mm-hmm. And then I see what frequency they're vibrating at, and if it's a new model or a different sized instrument, and for some reason I'm way off the mark, I can, at that point, remove the carbon fiber and recarve the braces. I've only ever done that once. Okay. I've only ever been that far off the mark once. But generally what I'll do is I'll clamp it on, I'll take the measurements, and then I'll glue the top on. And there's always a difference between clamping the top on and gluing the top on. And people often ask me, oh, what about all the clamps on the guitar? Isn't that affecting the modes? And of course it is affecting the modes, but as long as you record your data and you have sort of some consistency in your clamp top to the variation in your glued top, then you know sort of roughly what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
And then I glue the top on and I measure the modes again. And then I will begin to thin the edges of the top in sort of the, depending on the model, about 3 inches inside of the edge of the top. Mm-hmm. I will start thinning the edges down to roughly about 2 millimeters thick, but more than the thickness, I'm looking for targeting my mode frequencies. Mm-hmm. And hitting those frequencies, I don't want to jump the gun and nail them right then and there, because first of all, I have to install bindings, and bindings inevitably every single time you will remove a tiny amount of the edge of the top. Even if you are the most careful binding person in the whole world, you will remove some portion of stiffness from the edge of the top, and so that's going to lower your frequencies again. So you have to take that into account after you've done your initial edge thinning, and you also have to take into account that you're going to be adding substantial mass in the form of a neck being attached to the outside of the instrument, and your bridge, which is, depending on your bracing structure and your designs of the bridge, are adding mass and stiffness, because the bridge is a very big, it's the heaviest brace on the whole top of the instrument. And so you have to take all that into account, and
then your finish as well.
And then, yes, of course, your finish, which plays so much more of a role than sort of the average person might think. And I've had obviously theoretical ideas around what finish does, and also I've had instruments that I would say were ruined by a thick, in particular, top finish. Finish on the back and sides and neck can be used advantageously if they are sort of a high mass, high density, high stiffness finish, and that's why my sort of ideal combination of finishes is a sort of modern formulation of French polish for the top, and a UV cured polyester back, sides, and neck. So getting back to the
tuning
modes, tuning. So yeah, you have to take into account all of those aspects, and as long as you have the tools to be able to measure the difference in frequency at each step, then you can hopefully very accurately achieve your particular goals. And I think it's important to say, like, you've got to know, or if you're using these methods, it's helpful to know why you're chasing those particular modes and frequencies. Like you were saying earlier, how you can sort of be chasing frequencies for the sake of chasing frequencies, not for the sort of practical understanding of, or scientific understanding of what attaining those frequencies is going to do for the overall sound of the instrument.
Exactly. So we're still doing your process here. So you've bound now. You've edged in. You've bound.
I bound the instrument, and it's dropped the frequencies a little bit.
Yeah.
And I measure before so I'll measure after edge thinning, I'll measure before binding, and then I'll measure after binding, and I record all my results. And then after binding, I will fit my neck and measure any difference there. And the neck fitting on my instruments and the way they're built doesn't have that much of an effect on the frequencies. Then
sorry, for these steps, when you're doing these measurements, are you basically just tracking what's happening, or would you ever at these steps then do additional edge thinning?
Okay, so yeah, I in a perfect world, I'm just tracking what's happening after I've thinned the edges of the top, but inevitably there are just so many variables in guitar construction that I'm often tweaking the frequencies slightly. And so even sanding the edges of the top with some 220, which is not going to remove a huge amount of material, but it can have a large effect on particular modes and at what frequency they're vibrating. And so I will tweak things ever so slightly with sanding the top. And again, if I've missed the mark slightly or I've gone too thin, then it's always easier in guitar construction to bring modes down, because reducing down in frequency, because reducing mass and stiffness throughout guitar construction is a lot easier than adding mass or adding stiffness. Yeah, you can add mass.
Easier to add mass, easier to remove stiffness.
Yes, exactly. But
and sorry, both of those things, adding mass and removing stiffness, have the same effect, being that it lowers your frequencies, your mode frequencies.
Yeah, but it's also where you add the mass, because if you add mass to the edges of the top, that mass is going to act more in sort of damping the and raising the frequencies than if you were to add the mass to the center of the top, to the center of that sort of monopole mode. And so when you are removing stiffness by thinning the edges of the top, you're removing mass, but the
Effect
mass
of
at
the
the edges
stiffness.
of the top is the stiffness is far more. Well, you can probably explain it better than I can.
I normally think of it as so when you're removing material, you're removing both mass and stiffness at the same time.
Yeah,
But in this case, the effect of the stiffness you're losing overpowers the effect of the mass you're losing.
exactly what I
So
was trying to say. And so at that point, I am tweaking the frequencies, and my main tool is removing material from the edges of the top. And then if by chance I've gone too low with my air or my top, a tool that I can use is I can increase the opening of the sound hole. So the smaller the sound hole, the lower the air resonance, and because everything is coupled, the lower every other frequency. The larger the sound hole, the higher the air resonance, and subsequently the higher of every other frequency. And so if I need to, I can open up the sound hole a little bit to raise my air or my top, because the air, the top, and the back are the main three resonances that sort of you worry the most about in guitar, in building guitar. And then the subsequent ones are down to sort of your bracing patterns and the structure of your sides and your back and all of these other sort of contributing factors. And so throughout the construction, those are the main three that I'm worried about. And then if I'm chasing a sort of different tonal color or higher range modal frequencies, I'll alter those with sort of different bracing patterns and potentially different woods. But throughout the construction of most guitars, those three are the three that I'm sort of most concerned about. And so then I've attached the neck, which has potentially lowered the frequencies, and I will check again and adjust if I need to. And you have to take into account whether you have a fingerboard extension, which is covering a portion of the sound hole, because that will lower your frequencies. And then I outsource the finishing on my back and sides and neck. So I'll send the guitars out to be finished, and generally the back frequency will go up a fair amount. Well, depends what you consider a fair amount, but it definitely goes up in frequency with the finish being added to the back, which I'm not too concerned about, because I can very effectively lower that frequency via shaving the back brace, because there's no carbon fiber on the lowest brace of the back. And then I've got the instrument back. I do my French polish. I measure the difference in modal frequencies from before I start finishing and after. And generally, the difference is I can't even measure it, because I make sure that the finish is extremely thin. So that is adding as little mass and as little stiffness to the top as possible in that stage, because you've got everything sort of ideally where you want it up to the point of adding the bridge. And so you're essentially guessing as to, well, not guessing if you've recorded data from previous builds. You can also do the calculations. Say if this was your first guitar, there are calculations you can do to figure out what the bridge is going to do to the top, to the air top and back resonances, and so yeah, you've basically got everything to their ideal position for that critical contributing factor of the bridge being glued onto the top. And then you've got the bridge on, and you've missed the mark completely. You're like, what did I do? Oh no! And then you've still got a range of tools that you can use. You've got to take into account, of course, that you've got your saddle and bridge pins, which are generally around about 4 or 5 grams each. Your bridge pins are about 5 grams, and your saddle is about 4 grams. And you've got to take into account that factor of mass. And so then you
I'm sorry, that's one of the few places where you're only adding mass. You're not affecting your stiffness.
yes.
If you were to change, for example, your pin material or your saddle material.
Absolutely. So an ebony set of bridge pins is around 4 or 5 grams, whereas a plastic set of bridge pins, I think, is like 1.5 or 2 grams or something like that. And so that's a good amount of mass that you have to play with. Oh, and also with your bridge, you can use variable amounts of mass to lower. Say your top is an air are just higher than you anticipated them being. You can use a slightly higher mass bridge to get those lower, but you have to take into account that the more mass you put on the center of the top is essentially more damping of the lower vibrational modes. And so, me personally, I always shoot for an extremely low mass bridge, and then that gives me an extra tool in my tool belt for tuning the modes, where I'm happy to use a slightly higher mass set of bridge pins in regards to having that as a tool for tuning, because I already know I've gotten the bridge so as low mass as I can get it.
And so maybe it's worth mentioning what a typical bridge mass is for you.
For me, a typical bridge mass is between 15 and 20 grams.
And that's super light. So, and for reference, what would you say a regular bridge, say like a modern bridge? What sort of range would that be?
I think that they're up around, I mean, I haven't weighed one in a long time, but they're like 30 to 40 grams.
Right. And that's a pretty major difference.
Yeah, huge difference. And a difference that I personally experienced, I had this beautiful piece of cocobolo, and I really wanted to use it as a bridge. And cocobolo is fairly high density. It's a heavy wood, but I had a low mass sort of design where I'm removing as much material as possible, and it was only, I think the bridge ended up being around about 25 grams, which I thought, oh, well, that's not too bad. And I ended up using the bridge. That was the worst sounding guitar I've ever made.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
And 25 is light. Generally, people consider. I mean, I consider that to be a pretty light bridge.
And so I ended up taking that bridge off, and I put my good old trusty Paducah bridge on, and it was around about a 16-gram bridge, and the instrument just opened up instantly, and that was all the proof I needed to never use a high mass bridge again. I have used Paducah bridges that are closer to sort of 20 grams with great success on larger instruments, where it's sort of desirable to have a little bit more headroom, because a larger instrument is generally played harder and heavier than something smaller might be, and depending on or sort of what style and what application the guitar was going to be used in. This guitar, particular guitar where I used the 20-gram bridge, it was a 7-string steel string guitar, and I actually needed that little bit of extra mass to get the resonances as low as I wanted them. And also, the instrument was going to be played by a professional musician in a live setting. And he played a variety of styles of music and wanted that little bit of extra headroom that slight bit of extra mass gives, where the top doesn't become sort of overdriven and a little bit muddy. And he also wanted to sort of limit feedback slightly. And so that higher mass bridge, the instrument still sounded great, but it sort of served a purpose in that application. And so, okay, we've got our bridge on, and let's say things are going in the right direction, and we've got our bridge pins and our saddle in, and we've strung it up, and there are a few modes that are still not right. Say your top is still too high. So at this stage in my style of construction, I could, let's say the top and the back are too high. So the back is too high, and ideally you want the back to be around about 4 semitones away from the top. That's at its ideal location, so that it contributes a third peak into the top's response, where it is coupling with the top resonance of the instrument, but it's not sucking so much energy from the top that you start losing. It starts sucking energy instead of coupling efficiently. Now, let's say the back's too high and the top's too high. So then I would, because I have the ability, because there's no carbon fiber on the back of the back braces, I can reach inside and shave the lowest back brace. And as I'm shaving the brace, I will do a couple of passes and then measure, and then do a couple more passes with my plane, and then measure the frequencies again. And you really don't want to go too low, because it's much harder to add stiffness to the back than it is to remove stiffness. And so as you lower the back frequency, all of the lower modes are coupled and repelled by each other. And so as you're lowering the back frequency, you're also lowering the top, and you're sort of taking all the measurements, and you're also lowering the air. And so that's one great tool. But say you hit that 4 semitones and the top is still too high, well, you can take some notes there and go, okay, well, for my next build, I obviously maybe need to carve the braces just a little bit more before I add the carbon. But you can also then add mass to the sides, because adding mass to the sides basically focuses more energy back into the top, lowering the modes of vibration. The back will generally stay where it is, but the top will lower. Top and air will lower when adding mass to the sides of the instrument. Stiffness in the sides reflects vibration back into the top. Mass increases the vibrating area of the top.
Yeah, so maybe it's worth explaining that. What's happening when your strings vibrate, they're pumping your top up and down. And what's happening, just like a string forms a wave. The top is forming a wave in plane, so it's sort of like a drop in a pool of water, sort of ripple kind of thing. It's a way to visualize it, at least. And so what's happening when your top is moving into the guitar? I'm trying to explain with my hands. So when the top is going into the guitar, your sides are lifting up, and when your top is pumping up, that shape goes into means your sides are going down. So it's your sides are essentially bouncing up and down as your top is vibrating.
Yeah.
And there's a balance between the momentum of the two. So now what happens when you add mass to your sides become heavier, and because you have to have that balance in momentum between the top moving and the sides, that means a larger area of the top gets activated in that monofold mode to balance the momentum. So you get a bigger surface area of the top vibrating, which gives you a bigger mass, a larger mass vibrating, and that is what causes your top fundamental to drop when you add mass to the sides.
We were talking about basically my methods for
doing
the modes from beginning to end, and hopefully now that we're at the end, we've got all our modes exactly where we want them. And if we don't, then for the next guitar, you need to sort of think about your mass and stiffness a little bit differently.
Mm. And so when you're at that stage right at the end, it sounds like you're relying on past builds to sort of get your air right at the end, because it doesn't sound like you can do much to alter your air once the finish is on the instrument. Is that right?
You can drill a hole in the side and
Right.
add a sound port if you want.
Right. Right.
If your air is too low, like way too low, you can do that. You can, and I've done it.
Mm-hmm.
You can put a sound port in and raise your air resonance. You can also, if your air resonance is too high, you could somehow fashion some kind of tournevis, which is basically that cylindrical sound hole sort of extension.
So what's happening there is your air resonance is that column of air in your sound hole bouncing up and down on the stiffness of the air inside the cavity. So when air is being pushed into the box, it expands your top and back, and your top and back have a certain amount of stiffness to them, and that resistance they provide creates a reaction force pushing that column of air that is being pushed into the box back out. And since you have a periodic or repeating force being applied to your top and back, that column of air is bouncing up and down in your sound hole. And when you add the tournevis, if that's how it's pronounced, which is basically like a throat or almost like a funnel that you're adding to your sound hole, you're essentially creating a thicker pocket of air that needs to bounce up and down. And a thicker pocket of air has a higher mass than a thin pocket of air. And therefore, you're bouncing a heavier mass up and down on the same stiffness because you haven't changed your top and back. And you're increasing mass, stiffness stays the same, so your frequency drops.
Good explanation.